Funding for Frontline is provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Tonight, on Frontline, life on an Indian reservation.
When I look out at that river, I see a number of families that can still live basically the way our ancestors did. You can do that at Quinault.
The Quinault Indians live on one of the most beautiful reservations in America, but they are plagued by problems of alcohol, drugs, and unemployment.
Right now, we're just like a social welfare government.
Tonight, Indian Country.
From the network of public television stations, a presentation of KCTS Seattle, WNET New York, WPBT Miami, WTVS Detroit, and WGBH Boston. This is Frontline with Judy Woodruff.
Good evening. 3 weeks ago, during the Moscow summit, President Reagan, responding to a question from a Russian student, said that perhaps the United States had made a mistake in trying to preserve the culture of American Indians on reservations. Maybe, said the president, we should not have humored them in that, wanting to stay in that kind of primitive lifestyle. Maybe we should have said, no, come join us. Be citizens along with the rest of us. Well, many Indian leaders were outraged by the president's remarks, pointing out that Indians became full citizens in 1924, and complaining that Reagan has shown little interest in America's 1.4 million Indians, more than half of whom live on reservations. Tonight, Frontline journeys into Indian country to examine life on one reservation in the state of Washington. Each of the 300 reservations in America tells a different story of Indian life. Tonight's program is about a people blessed in many ways, but a tribe that is still struggling to survive. Tonight's story was reported by Joe Rosenblum and Mark Trahant. Trahant is a member of Idaho's Shoshone-Bannock Indian tribe and a reporter for the Arizona Republic. Our program was produced by Michael Kirk. It is called Indian Country.
The Quinault River, one of the world's richest salmon spawning grounds. Taholah, at the mouth of the river, is the tribal headquarters of the Quinault Indians. At one time, this reservation had an abundance of natural resources, timber and fish. Oliver Mason is the ceremonial chief of the Quinaults.
You go and you talk to the ocean. You pray to the ocean and you ask the ocean to bring in salmon for your people, to return those that are lost, to give safe journey and lots of hunting to the ones that are going out. You come to the river and you ask the river to be kind to your people that are traveling up the river, to bring plenty of fish in the river, give it to the spots that are fishing.
Chief Mason is the great-grandson of Chief Taholah, who signed the original treaty with the U.S. for the Quinaults.
You go up and sit on Point Granville up here where my family lived, and the chief lived at that time. And as far as you could see south to the Columbia River, we traveled. As far as we could see north by going on that point, we traveled.
For hundreds of years, the Quinaults have fished and hunted here on the Pacific coast of the state of Washington. They lived simply along the 4 rivers that flow through the reservation. But when the treaties were signed, the Quinaults gave up millions of acres of prime land. The U.S. government guaranteed education, medical care, and a reservation of 200,000 acres.
So we agreed to cede that area to the United States government in return for this land here. And in return, we also ceded 50% of our fishing to the white man.
They signed a treaty in 1859. It has the same force of law as a treaty between the U.S. and other sovereign nations. In return for land, the U.S. guaranteed that the Quinaults would always have their own reservation. But for 100 years, the Indians were subject to the control of the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs. During this time, the Quinaults lost most of their fish to white commercial fishermen and their forests to the government and white-owned logging companies. But that wasn't the worst of it. By the 1920s, there were only a few hundred Quinaults left. By the 1950s, alcohol and suicide were becoming problems. Then, in the 1960s, even the continued existence of the reservation itself was threatened. Over the years, nearly one-third of the Quinaults' land had been purchased by whites. Many were hoping to develop it as vacation property. A new highway under construction through the heart of the reservation threatened to open it to heavy tourist traffic. And the Quinault beaches were being invaded by a multitude of non-Indians. By 1967, the Quinault Indian Reservation was a shambles. The elders felt the tribe needed a new, dynamic leader. They remembered a young man who no longer lived on the reservation. His name was Joe DeLaCruz. He had been a local athlete, the son of a labor leader, and the descendant of a chief of a Canadian band of the Suquamish tribe. He left the reservation to join the Army in the mid-50s. He went to college and took a desk job with the federal government in Portland, Oregon. The elders convinced him to return home to help the tribe.
I've always had a feeling that of myself first as an Indian, and secondly as an American.
DeLaCruz was one of a new group of educated and ambitious tribal leaders. These modern Indian warriors reasserted their tribe's independence.
I think all we're saying, the Quinault people, is what we have left is ours. And even though it's not in very good shape, let us alone, or maybe help us rebuild it.
When DeLaCruz took over the leadership, there were only 620 Quinaults left on the 300-square-mile reservation. Its culture was in jeopardy, so DeLaCruz set out to rebuild the tribe's spirit, reviving its legends, songs, and games, like counting all the leaves on a fern without taking a breath. And DeLaCruz decided to draw the line on behalf of his tribe. They were going to take control of the reservation.
We had a lot of publicity, a lot of opposition. We ended up with a lot of people supporting us. We closed the beach.
DeLaCruz explained to Frontline reporter Mark Trehant how he closed the Quinault beaches to all non-Indians. He stopped construction of the highway through the reservation and passed stiff zoning laws to stop non-Indian speculators.
Those type of things brought the people together. We haven't had any of those major type of, I guess you might call them uprisings, that bring people together. And
the beaches remain closed to this day, but every spring, non-Indians return to the border of the reservation for the surf and the clams.
I'm not doing well. My husband's doing beautifully. Wouldn't you know?
There he is. Little dinky booger. Not very big.
Whites like these were excluded from the reservation's beaches when DeLaCruz exercised their treaty rights to act as an independent nation, to pass their own laws and enforce them with their own police.
And I can recall an example where some surfers didn't believe we were serious. And back in 69, 70, people with their CB, somebody said there were some surfers down on the beach, and it was almost like automatic within minutes. There was like 100 pickups and cars of Indians coming down here, and those poor surfers were heading for Japan or China, but one of our guys fired a rifle up in the air, and they came in, and we confiscated their surfboards and took them down to the tribal police headquarters. And of course, that got in the papers, and our people were very determined, and we were all 100% together.
The highway that DeLaCruz stopped has been unfinished for nearly 20 years. This bridge marks the northernmost point of construction. It is known as the Bridge to Nowhere.
The other thing that was happening at that same point in time was real estate speculators were coming onto the reservation buying fee land and starting to set up real estate developments, and the tribe didn't like that.
So DeLaCruz worked out tough zoning ordinances and forced non-Indian developers to comply with Quinault laws. The development stopped.
When I came home in '67, the fisheries was pretty much down. The timber industry was in a decline. The mills that people had normally worked in were all shut down, and it was pretty basically depressed. This was one of the most depressed little communities, I guess you might say, in the whole state of Washington at that time.
First, DeLaCruz tried to start a variety of business ventures: a logging company, a sawmill, an auto body shop. They all failed. So DeLaCruz decided to head for Washington, D.C. Like many state and local leaders, he would learn to use the federal bureaucracy to rebuild his tribe. DeLaCruz's top priority was to capture enough federal money to restore the tribe's fishing industry.
When I look out at that river, I see a number of families that can still live basically the way our ancestors did, off the river, off the fish, off the resource. There ain't anywhere else in the world that you can sit in one community and live very contently. You may not ever become real wealthy, but live on the river system and do what your ancestors did. You can do that at Quinault.
Today, Inky Charlie and his son Tandy are among those Quinaults trying to make their livings fishing. Inky grew up on the reservation. He's fished this river all his life. Tandy is his 25-year-old son. He and his father earn extra money guiding white fishermen on Quinault rivers. At the height of the season, at least 200 Quinaults fish these rivers. Families like the Charlies are given the right to fish in an area assigned by the tribe, almost like a family franchise. Nets are placed across the river. This week, the tribe says Tandy and Inky can fish for only 2 days, so that enough salmon can escape up the river to spawn. And today, Tandy's catch is light.
Up to this boat. He's another blueback. Caught one here the other day. Make sure this guy don't fall out. There he is. He's about ready to fall out there. It's the best eating fish there. Well, it looks pretty dirty out here. I don't think there'll be too much hitting out here. I get lucky. Never know when a fish is gonna hit though. You get it while it's there. You know, I never really started fishing steady until about two or three years ago. Before that, you know, I was in high school. I got drafted into pro ball by the Baltimore Orioles.
In 1981, Tandy left the reservation to play professional baseball. It was the culmination of a lifetime dream.
I've been dreaming about it since I was a kid. Geez, ever since I was 11 years old, my dad used to have me out there, you know, half hour in the morning, you know, before breakfast or after breakfast, or half hour in the evening playing catch with my brother.
While he was going through school, everybody loved him because he was the essence of what we all want to be, an athlete, a leader of the young, just like his father and his uncle, his grandfather.
For 4 seasons, Tandy bounced around the minor leagues, far away from the reservation for the first time.
I don't know, my friends called me Tonto, and some called me Chief, and, others called me by my name. And when I was playing in Hagerstown, they said I was full-blooded Sioux, which I wasn't. I felt really special because there ain't that many Indians playing pro baseball.
But 2 years ago, Tandy developed arm trouble. His playing days were over.
I was hoping I could try to get back there maybe this summer or something, get a tryout somewhere. And hopefully I can. But I'd rather be playing baseball than fishing, But this, this is just another way of life, So if baseball doesn't work out, there's always something else to do. I guess it ain't everything. It's the only thing.
He's going to be what we call a pillar. Each person becomes a pillar into what we're building for the future, and he's going to be a center post.
When Tandy came back home, when his arm went bad, he didn't come to the tribe saying, hey, I need a job, I need this, I need that. Tandy immediately went to the river fishing and guiding. They'll find something to do and they'll do it. And those are, I guess, probably that's the silent majority type part of the population.
But DeLaCruz says it hasn't been easy for the Quinaults to support themselves fishing. By the late 1960s, the fish here were in sharp decline. So the Quinaults joined with other Northwest Indian tribes and sued the state and federal governments. They wanted to regain control of at least half the fish. The tribes won. Now, tribal scientists spend millions of federal dollars operating hatcheries and managing rivers to try to keep Tandy and Inky fishing. The fish are sold back at the tribally owned packing plant in Tohola. All Quinaults are required to sell their fish here, so the tribe can keep track of how many are caught. Today, Tandy and Inky split $46.07. The reality is only a few Quinaults can support themselves and their families fishing full-time. But fishing is central to DeLaCruz's economic strategy, and the cornerstone of the tribe's business development is the fish processing and packaging plant. The plant generates more than $5 million for the tribe's economy. It was originally financed with the help of federal grants. Recently, DeLaCruz cut a deal with a Japanese company he hopes will keep the plant in the black. Here, the eggs, or roe, are removed from herring and packaged for shipment to a company in Japan called Maruko.
We contract and lease this little section of our seafood plant to Maruko, and they buy our salmon roe. And they do their separations of the roe. They put them in their own boxes, and they have the Japanese writing on the mark of where the salmon roe came from.
Tetsuya Komagi is Maruko's representative to the Quinaults. DeLaCruz considers this deal with the Japanese his biggest business coup. But the plant is the only tribal business in operation and provides only a handful of full-time jobs. Many more jobs are available in local tribal government, which has prospered under Joe DeLaCruz. He says this is where his trips to Washington have paid off. More than 90% of the tribe's annual $6 million budget comes from the federal government. Since taking over the tribe, he has used federal funds to increase the tribe bureaucracy from 6 to 175 employees. To govern a reservation of 1,000 Indians, DeLaCruz has assembled 14 departments, covering everything from law enforcement to senior citizens. The average salary among those employees is $20,000. DeLaCruz himself earns $50,000. And many people on the payroll are related to DeLaCruz. For example, his brother James is in charge of senior citizen programs, his stepfather Ike is the tribe's health manager, his brother-in-law Jim is head of the cable TV network, and his other brother-in-law Francis is head of the Office of Community Development. The tribal government administers the millions of federal dollars DeLaCruz captures, including hundreds of thousands for financing new housing.
In 20 years, almost, other than what houses that were along this main road, everything from here on up is all new houses. And that was part of the Tribal Housing Urban Development Program, HUD houses.
But on the reservation, opposition to this reliance on federal money is beginning to build. Mike Mayle is the chairman of the school board and the strongest political opponent DeLaCruz has.
I believe Joe's time has passed. There's nothing solid here. There's nothing real to give people confidence that their tribal government is actually delivering their future to them. We've only got one business in this town that is Indian-owned. After 17 years of leadership of one man, that's not economic development. We still have a 50% high school dropout rate. Our 4th and 8th grade test scores were the worst in the county last year. Are we really making education a priority? Obviously, we're not doing that.
The reservation has its own elementary school run by the Quinaults. Mayle charges that these children's academic problems begin at home.
I know that the alcoholism rate among our people is too high. I know the drug usage is too high. We need to do something. It's a shame upon our nation that we are not really actively doing something to curb that.
Mayle says DeLaCruz simply doesn't want to face up to these sensitive social problems that are escalating despite DeLaCruz's success in getting money out of Washington.
Joel's a lobbyist. I believe Joel spends entirely too much time away from the reservation, too much time away from the Quinault Nation to be an effective leader.
DeLaCruz does spend most of his time away from the reservation.
Hi, how you doing?
Fine,
Thank you. Welcome aboard.
Most of the time when I have to end up coming to Washington, I'm working on specific legislation or appropriations in regard to Quinault and other tribes in the Northwest. When I come to this city, usually I have some specific things that I want to try to accomplish with various senators or various congressmen, and I don't like coming to this city. I try to make my stays no longer than 3 days and come into the city with my appointments made and see the people I have to see and get out of the city.
Hello, how are you?
Hi.
Good morning. Hi, come right on in.
Want some coffee?
Yeah, some coffee. How's that?
Good seeing you again.
Happy birthday, Joe.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Over the years, DeLaCruz has become as familiar with the politics in the nation's capital as on the reservation. These are the offices of the lobbying firm he uses as his eyes and ears around Washington.
I think we're going to be a little late on that. But I requested the information down the line on the Indian preference. And also
Joe Talixon has worked for DeLaCruz for the last 20 years. Juliet Pittman has known DeLaCruz since he was president of the National Congress of American Indians in the early 1980s.
When Joe comes to town, our phone starts to ring because people know he's here.
Yeah, I mean, he's almost like a celebrity in his own right, but not for the showmanship of it, more or less for the good of it, for the others.
People reaching out, people, they want to talk to them about this issue or that issue, and whether it's Indians on the Atlantic coast in Nicaragua or it's someone dealing with Indian child welfare. You know, he's just been there out on the forefront on so many issues.
I don't carry a lot of papers around in my briefcase when I'm in Washington, D.C. I carry select Quinault smoked salmon, and they remember who Quinault is when they get a package of salmon.
What's all this? You're going to Hollywood?
Well, we're going to get us, they're accusing you and I of some things together out in the Washington state.
What's this all?
Hawaii's Senator Daniel Inouye is chairman of the Indian Affairs Committee. Inouye has just returned from a fact-finding tour on a number of reservations.
But I learned something on this 1 week's journey to Indian country, that they still have hope.
Oh, yeah.
And they're optimistic, and sometimes I wonder how people can be that optimistic after 200 years of trust violations by the United States government. But they're there. They're struggling, but they haven't given up.
Translation: the problems on Indian reservations are Washington's fault, and any answer would require more money. It is not a philosophy shared by the Reagan administration. In Moscow during the recent summit, the president had this to say.
Let me tell you just a little something about the American Indian in our land. We have provided millions of acres of land for what are called the preservations, or the reservations, I should say. They, from the beginning, announced that they wanted to maintain their way of life as they had always lived there in the desert and the plains and so forth. Maybe we made a mistake. Maybe we should not have humored them in that wanting to stay in that kind of primitive lifestyle. Maybe we should have said, no, come join us, be citizens, along with the rest of us.
And this attitude worries Joe DeLaCruz.
I strongly believe that the administration, this present Republican administration, and their whole strategy is get the United States out of the Indian business.
The Reagan position is argued by Ross Swimmer, a Cherokee and, as Assistant Secretary of Interior, the highest-ranking federal official on Indian policy. Swimmer believes the problems on reservations stem from too much federal money. He argues the money worsens social ills by creating dependency. DeLaCruz believes that position is a more fundamental threat to his tribe than the social problems he confronts at home. So Frontline brought DeLaCruz and Swimmer together for this meeting.
We put billions and billions of dollars on those reservations in the name of doing good. We went out and built thousands of three-bedroom ranch-style modern homes with running water for people that had never seen running water and never seen that kind of a home on their reservation. We, the federal government, said, here's what's good for you. Take it. If you don't want it, I'm going to give it someplace else. The Indians took it. We have now created an environment that is awfully desperate out there. And it's pulling more and more people to the reservation because you can live on the reservation, you can survive on the reservation, you can get free health care on the reservation, you can get some modicum of housing, you can get free food, but what you can't get quality education, public schools or BI schools. You can't get jobs.
The argument between the two quickly heated up. DeLaCruz argued that the federal government owes tribes whatever they need until they're self-sufficient.
That's right. Because I think there's got to be some protecting things here. After 200 years, you have a situation that it was the stronger nations conquering weaker nations, and tribes are actually weaker now than they were 200 years ago. And there's got to be some cushions.
But Swimmer blames tribal governments for not taking care of their own people.
When we're sitting here with 20% of the natural resources of this country on reservation, 50 million acres of land, $1.5 billion in the bank, and $3 billion of federal aid, you can't tell me the tribal government is doing what it's supposed to do out there to make things happen.
How can tribal government in 2 decades
20 years? How long do you
20 years, pull itself together after 5 generations of paternalism up to that point. I think some tribal governments have...
Paternalism has to continue. You're saying some tribes must stay under the BIA?
You're mixing up paternalism with economic help. And the United States is the United States is appropriating money to governments all over the world to strengthen their governments. They're doing it throughout the Pacific. They're doing it up in the Bering Sea.
We're spending $3 billion. Is that not meeting its obligation? What would be the right amount of money to meet its obligation? 10 billion, 20 billion, 100 billion? What's the price tag?
United States,
not to make things happen out
the United States is spending $3 billion.
They argued for nearly 2 hours. Past administrations have articulated a different Indian policy based on the belief that the United States has failed to live up to its treaty commitments. Stuart Udall was Secretary of the Interior in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations.
I can't buy into the idea that this government's been generous with Indians. They haven't been. There's no question about that in my mind. And to say that that the money we're investing now in helping them in education and development, that's wasted, some of it is. And we ought to focus on that, I grant you. But what's needed is probably more effort, not less. Don't give up. That's my message. And to begrudge the modest amounts that we appropriate for them, I just don't think that's contrary to the American spirit. I think we are a generous people, and I don't think we've done enough. That's my feeling.
The next stop is Washington State Senator Dan Evans' office.
How was your trip?
How are you? Oh, God.
Evans and his staff have just helped DeLaCruz buy 10,000 acres of timberland for the Quinaults. The way the deal was done is vintage DeLaCruz.
I was watching the Iran-Contra hearings and one day, and it came up in the hearings that General Secord and he came were negotiating for 10,000 acres of property on Indian reservation out in the west, and it was a bankrupt property. And immediately I knew what they were talking about. They were talking about a former logging company's bankruptcy on the Quinault Reservation.
Yeah, I was going to say, you're a better
So DeLaCruz immediately got on the phone to Evans' office. He told them the Quinaults wanted to buy that land. They then enlisted the Interior Department's help arranging financing for the property. According to Evans, none of it would have happened if DeLaCruz hadn't known how to use the negative publicity surrounding the Iran-Gate scandal to the tribe's advantage.
And certainly for the Quinaults, it was a very big issue. And he knew how to use it, and I think that it all worked out pretty well.
The spring of 1988, back in Washington State, a small bank in a town 45 miles from the reservation. Joe and his lawyers are trying to put the finishing touches on the loan for the Iran-Gate land.
I take it, Omar, you don't come down here that often.
DeLaCruz needs $4.5 million. The Bureau of Indian Affairs will guarantee the loan, but the bank is nervous. DeLaCruz invokes the name of a powerful Washington friend.
Of that land, and of course, Senator Inouye, being chairman of the Senate Indian Affairs Committee, looking into some of the history of Indian lands, has had a high concern about trying to get some of these basic lands within reservations back to tribes.
During the meeting, DeLaCruz also makes it clear that this bank needs the millions of dollars of Indian deposits it receives. The bank approves the loan, and the Quinaults get their land. More than 50 years ago, the federal government divided the entire reservation among 2,300 Quinaults. Some of them sold their land to white logging companies and individuals. DeLaCruz has been trying to buy that land back.
I think with that property, some of the other things we've got in fisheries development, that the Quinault people and Quinault tribe could be totally self-sufficient, dependent on no one. And that's where I'd like to see the Quinault tribe.
Reservation land is a checkerboard of parcels owned by the tribe, individual Indians, and white-owned logging companies and other non-Indians. DeLaCruz has often said he wants to reacquire at least 100,000 acres for the tribe. So far, he's gotten only 18,000. But not everyone on the reservation supports DeLaCruz's policy of buying land. Mike Mayle believes the tribe has more important concerns.
Face the fact that you've got all these massive social problems. You got drug and alcohol, and the number one priority, I say, has to be education. Do you want to take your last $3 million and blow it on 10,000 acres of land?
Mayle says DeLaCruz must recognize and deal with a variety of serious responded to a call on April 2nd that a young Quinault had been shot. Dead was 24-year-old Kevin Papp, Joe DeLaCruz's second cousin. Authorities say he died from a single shot at close range from a .22 caliber rifle. Police located a suspect at a nearby house where he had fled with the rifle.
The subject that was suspect in the shooting was located at this residence. This is his brother's home. This is where our negotiator was conducting a conversation with him and trying to talk him out of doing any harm to himself.
The man who surrendered to police after a 4-hour standoff was 28-year-old Gary Brown. He was later charged with first-degree manslaughter, and he pled not guilty by reason of insanity. Gary Brown is DeLaCruz's nephew. Brown told police that he and Papp were alone in a room when the gun discharged accidentally. Nobody else knows what really happened, but people who knew the two men know this. They were both high school dropouts. They both had trouble holding a job, and alcohol was part of their lives. Lillian Swift lived with the victim, Papp, and their 3-year-old daughter, Tisha.
I think he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And, of course, drugs and alcohol don't help. You know, they make people do things that they shouldn't do. He was always on what they considered the wrong side of the tracks. And he'd been raised around a lot of alcohol and, you know, the emotional damages that alcohol does to families.
Lillian is Chief Mason's daughter. Many on this reservation acknowledge that Papp's death has caused them to begin to seriously question tribal attitudes about drugs and alcohol. Even Joe DeLaCruz's attitude was changed. This interview was done before the shooting.
I don't see it as a big problem. I guess you might, back when I was young, we might have had 2 or 3 people for a town this size. You might say we had 3 guys that might have been town drunks. Basically, I don't think we have a town drunk right now. So, you know, I guess it's the perception of how you look at alcoholism.
But after his nephew shot his second cousin, DeLaCruz had this to say.
To learn that we have some problems as far as problems that our generation didn't have to face or deal with. I mean, my generation, we drank beer and we done things like that. What you have now in this generation is a mixture of actually liquor and drugs. And we don't need to look very far to see what happens when you got that type of a problem.
Guys, get out of here. Hey. Why that? Get out of here.
Is this reserved?
But there are Quinaults who charge that DeLaCruz and his tribal government have never cared very much about the deep social problems on the reservation.
Hello, Andrea. You always get over good movies.
The head alcohol counselor here says as many as 70% of the families on this reservation have at least one member with a drug or alcohol problem. Like most Indian tribes, the Quinaults have their own police and court system, and DeLaCruz is in charge.
10 out of 1, 6 to 6.
Sandy Wells is his police chief. Wells believes alcohol and drugs are the most important problems he faces.
Biggest share of our inmates are in here. They're really intoxicated or under the influence of drugs when they were arrested. I'd probably have to say probably about 90-95% of them.
The Quinaults once had 30 federally funded officers, but despite the tribal government's growth in other areas, DeLaCruz critics say he has allowed the force to dwindle to only 8. Wells says the police department has for years had too little manpower to crack down on drugs.
Since I've been here, we haven't actually had a drug bust in the village, but we had one within our department. Somehow inmates got drugs brought into them. Did a search of our jail. We found marijuana and traces of cocaine.
Wells is the 6th police chief DeLaCruz has hired in the last 8 years. There have also been 3 prosecuting attorneys in the last 3 years. And this entire spring, there was no prosecuting attorney. And there's another problem: unemployment. Here at the fish processing plant, the tribe's only successful business venture, just 100 Quinaults work about 5 months out of the year. Only 25 work year-round. Today, the Quinaults are a long way from solving their employment problems. Tribal industry is inadequate, and when it comes to small businesses owned by individual Indians, this is the only success story. And Jiggy Shale is the owner.
Store started in 1984 with a bank loan from First Interstate Bank, $3,000 loan. No, our original investment was $3,000, and we got a $10,000 loan off that from First Interstate Bank. We just videos and arcade games.
Shale is the former treasurer of the tribe. He believes DeLaCruz's administration sacrifices economic development in favor of feeding the tribal bureaucracy.
You know, right now we're just like a social welfare government, getting pacified by the feds. And that's it. You know, they're applying it in the wrong areas. They're applying it to social programs instead of economic development.
And Mike Mayle fears an economic and social collapse if the flow of federal money slows to a trickle.
The federal government, they're starting to make cutbacks now. You know, where people are on edge, you know, there's a certain amount of anxiety. Are we really going to have our job next year? You know, and it's been a perennial thing.
While the tribe's leaders argue about politics, people here must get on with their lives. A new generation of Quinaults is coming into its own. Quinaults raised under DeLaCruz leadership.
This is home, you know. It'll always be home, you know. It's, you know, families here, and everybody in the reservation's family. You know, everybody's so tight-knit, you know. Everybody's your neighbor.
Everybody knows Tandy. Even if you hear his name, somebody hears his name. Well, I heard that name before, you know. You played ball.
18-year-old Lynette McCrory has lived on the reservation all her life.
I dropped out in the 11th grade, and I went back when I was a senior, but I didn't go all the way. I quit because I met Tandy, and I just fell in love, and I quit school. I felt nothing else mattered.
Lynette and Tandy were married this spring. Quinaults from throughout the Northwest came together for a wedding between the children of two of the tribe's leading families.
I always tell Shirley, well, I'm going to have a big wedding when I get married. She never did believe me. And I hadn't planned on having that big of a wedding because it was an expensive wedding, really expensive. And my dad says, well, I don't want you to have, second best. I want you to have best. So he bought me that dress. I ordered it through JCPenney's catalog. It was there on the front page, and I said, that's the dress I want.
And I say to you, Tandy, that you're to love your wife. You cherish.
I was thinking about all the beautiful people sitting around her, but I was also looking and I was thinking about the families that were there.
DeLaCruz is Lynette's great uncle. Her great-great-grandfather was chief of one of the smaller tribes on the reservation. Tandy's great-grandfather was also a chief.
Tandy and Lynette, I have been ordained of God to perform the ceremony, and I want to pronounce you husband and wife to the world, to your people. You may kiss your wife, Tandy. Turn around. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet Mr. and Mrs. Tandy Charlie.
I've been going out with him for 2 years now, and we planned on getting married last year, but then I found out I was pregnant, so that changed everything. And because I didn't want to go up there, all big, and I wanted a big, nice, pretty wedding, and that's what I got.
Tandy and Lynette's reception. Salmon and a traditional song in an Indian church.
When I was 16, I met Tandy, and he changed my whole world. I stopped running around, and I stopped doing drugs, and because my mom and dad was always drinking, always bringing the party back to the house, to the trailer, and I always had to be there. Sometimes I feel like crying when I, see the kids and their parents. They have to go through what I went through. It's hard.
What was the hardest thing?
For me? I don't know. Seeing my mom and dad drunk. It's hard. I'd never treat my baby the way I got treated. I don't see how anybody can, be so cruel. I could never be cruel.
At the reception, Lynette's problems are temporarily put aside as 5 generations of this family look toward the future. Sean Tall, Lynette and Tandy's baby. Lynette's father, her grandmother, and great-grandmother, Joe DeLaCruz's mother.
Anytime any of my people are involved in a marriage or something good for the community, I like to get up and let them know that I care. And I think we all care. And I think we all wish these people a happy and a prosperous marriage.
In the 20 years since DeLaCruz returned to Indian country, more Quinaults live here. The tribe has created more jobs for them. Housing and health care are better. But despite his successful pursuit of tens of millions of federal dollars, problems like unemployment, alcoholism, and poor education are threatening his tribe. As he begins his third decade of leadership, DeLaCruz realizes that some of the Quinaults' problems are so deeply rooted that money alone cannot solve them.
Broken family, no more extended family structure, parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles taking care of things. That is a problem with about a third of the community, and it's been for a couple generations. The other thing, besides the broken family, the alcoholism thing, and actually no parents' guidance, is the lack of discipline in homes with television, with Jiggy's VCR stuff, the parents are not telling kids, they're 12 o'clock. They can stay up 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, even where you have families that don't have drinking problems or alcohol problems.
Many here say the introduction of cable TV and VCRs within the last 7 years has further eroded the Quinault's traditional culture.
1 little, 2 little, 3 little Indians, 4 little, 5 little, 6 little Indians. Everybody just really cracked up.
3 Quinault elders. Frida Charlie is Tandy's grandmother. They too lament the loss of their culture.
Well, I don't know what I want to think what I'd say.
We asked 80-year-old Hazel Underwood if she could remember anything in the Quinault language, a child's song or simple greeting.
No, I don't think so.
God, he used to say good morning to me and everything, and Quinault, me darned if I could remember.
Yes, it's kind of hard to.
Nice old man.
Let's see, Oh my. Since all the Quinaults are dead and gone, it's kind of hard to remember anything. Let me see how it.
Can you say fish or anything?
Is there a word for fish, Sully? No, I guess not.
Remember, really.
I don't.
Euless.
Euless, huh?
The euless. That's Quinault for fish. Euless.
Oh, gee, you know. Yeah, she knows more than I do about that. So.
People get into language, dance and songs and stuff, powwows. They think that's culture. And how much of the Quinault culture is left? I see about 250 people that are fishermen. They're happy. They're doing what our ancestors did. They're guiding. They get their deer. They get their elk. They live the way they want to live. Basically, to me, that's more culture than the powwow dancing thing.
But DeLaCruz critics contend that the Quinault way of life is in jeopardy. The forests here have been cut clean, and there are not enough fish to support new fishermen. So what kind of jobs will sustain them in the future? When half the students never finish high school, will they have the skills for other kinds of work? How much can the tribe continue to expand its federal payroll? And will the river supply enough fish to support Tandy Charlie if his boyhood dreams don't come true?
I was so close, and I just don't want to give it up, I feel I could throw. I want to be there someday up in the big leagues.
But as baseball becomes a more elusive dream, Tandy and Lynette, like the Quinaults, face an uncertain future.
I want him to go to college too and get a good job. I don't mind the way I live. I'm not saying I don't like the way I live. I just, I want him to have a good job because fishing ain't gonna last forever. We gotta think about the future.
When President Reagan made his informal remarks at the Moscow summit, it was the first time he had spoken publicly about American Indians during his entire presidency. and so his words continue to reverberate throughout Indian country. "I was appalled by the president's performance," replied one Indian leader, "but not surprised." And this leader said, "He has headed the worst administration for Indians since the days of outright warfare and extermination." The president did say in Moscow that he would be happy to meet with a delegation from the American Indian movement. If he does, it will be one of the rare encounters between this president and American Indians. Thank you for joining us. I'm Judy Woodruff. Good night.
Next week on Frontline, the nightmare of family violence and the failure of the system to save a battered woman.
She told him, "My husband's going to kill me."
Pamela Gunther was a victim of violence for years, but the system that was supposed to protect her didn't.
We knew it was going to happen. I mean, we were counting the days, basically.
Watch My Husband is Going to Kill Me, next time on Frontline.
Frontline is produced for the Documentary Consortium by WGBH Boston, which is solely responsible for its content. Funding for Frontline was provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Educational organizations may inquire about videocassettes by calling 1-800-424-7963. For a transcript of this program, please send $4 to Frontline, Box 322, Boston, Massachusetts, 02134.